Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction and welcome everyone to this meetup. As was described, we're going to go through the SAFe assessments, how we apply them, and some of the techniques we use to facilitate and analyze the data. I put a few topics together here with Jorgen's help. We'll start by talking about how SAFe approaches measurement, the model that we use for measurement, how the assessments fit into that in terms of measuring competency, the techniques that we've seen to be most effective in terms of facilitating them, and where during the SAFe implementation it makes most sense to run the assessments. And then, of course, how do we use that data to identify potential opportunities for improvement? We're going to conclude with some interesting research that Jorgen shared with me recently based on the business agility assessment, and then I'll hand it over for Jorgen to do a demo to show some of the things that I've mentioned in action. I'll probably take about 25-30 minutes, and then I'll hand it over to Jorgen for that demo. So let's get started. And some of you may know and be familiar with the approach that SAFe takes to measurement. But in case everyone isn't, I just want to take a few moments to describe what that looks like. We know that the goal of SAFe is business agility. And by business agility, we talk about the ability for an organization to compete and thrive in the digital age by being able to respond quickly with innovative and emerging solutions. But what we also know is that this is a journey that organizations are on. And if they're going to successfully achieve this goal, what they need to be able to do is measure along the way and use that data to make informed decisions to steer the transformation successfully. Many organizations that we talk to really struggle to understand what it is they should measure. And what that leads to eventually is the inability to really be able to quantify the improvements to ways of working and really understand the next steps they need to take on their journey towards business agility. So to try and support this and help organizations measure successfully, about 1.5 years ago, we started to invest in thinking about what would a measurement model look like in terms of measuring the progress towards business agility. And you can see that on the slide here. We started by asking ourselves, what are the key steps that any organization needs to put in place to change their operating model to one that is more responsive? And you can see that by the steps in the value stream here. They need to be able to go quickly from sensing a new opportunity to delivering that opportunity to the market. And once we understood the steps that an organization needed to take, the answer to the question as to what they should measure became more obvious. There were 3 key measurement domains, as we call them, that were pertinent to being measured. The first is flow. How efficient and effective are we at delivering value through these steps? The second is competency. That's what we're going to talk about today. How proficient are we in the Lean-Agile ways of working? Are we supporting our employees in developing the skills necessary to achieve business agility? And the third one is outcomes. Are we meeting the outcomes of our business stakeholders and customers? And it's really the combination of these 3 measurement domains that gives us the overall picture. We can certainly improve flow without improving outcomes. We can invest heavily in new ways of working in terms of training our employees, but if we're not changing our processes to be more effective, that'll have limited impact. Competency, though, is what I want to talk about today, because within SAFe, competency is measured through the SAFe assessments, and that's the topic of this particular meetup. So let's get into that and talk about how we do this. So within SAFe, we measure competency using the SAFe assessments, and we do this at 2 levels. We have the business agility assessment, which I'll show you shortly, that really assesses competency at a more strategic level. How proficient are we in our ways of working across an entire portfolio? And then we have the 7 core competency assessments. And those really allow us to dig much deeper to get the fidelity that we need to then work out what are the next steps we need to take in terms of improvements. You're going to see also on the next few slides that we have the ability through the Comparative Agility platform to not only manage our data, to map trends over time, but also think about how we might compare ourselves to other organizations that work in the same industry. So let's have a look at that first assessment, the business agility assessment. And this is a really key assessment for us. And you'll see shortly when I start talking about the use cases, this often forms the tipping point for organizations realizing that they need to change their current ways of working. So this will assess across all 7 core competencies. I'll talk more about the core competencies shortly. And typically we're applying the business agility assessment across a single portfolio. If you haven't yet started to organize or implement SAFe, you might think of a portfolio as a business unit. And within that portfolio, we're not looking for hundreds and hundreds of people to assess or to take the survey. Instead, we're looking for 20 to 30 people who are well-informed, leaders, business owners, members of the LACE, change agents, perhaps individuals from the arts within that portfolio, to help us assess where we are currently on our level of competency. There's 45 statements on the assessment, and what you'll find from this particular approach is that you'll be able to start to highlight some of those core areas that need more attention. So for example, we can see from the graphic on the slide here that lean portfolio management and team and technical agility are two areas that perhaps aren't performing as well as we want them to. Those might be the areas that we start to explore in more detail. Just be aware that this assessment is available in different languages. And as I mentioned previously, we can use the data that we've collected available through the Comparative Agility platform to benchmark against other industries. That's a great way to understand whether we're performing in a manner that will lead us to being competitive. So once we have an understanding from this assessment as to the broad areas of improvement, then we need to start to dig a little bit deeper. And that's where the 7 core competency assessments come in. At the heart of SAFE, with its goal of business agility, we describe 7 core competencies that you can see on the slide here. And these core competencies really help an organization understand what it means to work effectively at each level of the framework. Team and technical agility, for example, will talk about the proficiencies we need to develop in terms of agile teams, teams of agile teams, and built-in quality. Things like Agile Product Delivery will talk about the need to develop customer centricity and be able to release on demand. And while all of these core competencies are independent, they're also interdependent. And what we see time and time again, and you'll see this in the research that Jorgen shared that I put in the slides at the end of this presentation, organizations who can have a level of proficiency across all these 7 core competencies are ultimately the ones that attain higher levels of business agility. So to support these, we have an assessment for each of them. And on the slide here, I put the team and technical agility assessment. And the big difference here is that whereas the business agility assessment has in total 45 statements across all 7 core competencies, this team and technical agility core competency assessment has around 45 questions specifically on what it means to attain high levels of team and technical agility. And what we find is that this allows you to generate the data you need to really then understand where the improvements need to be made. I'm going to talk later about how we use the assessments effectively, but I will say something just now about how we perceive the assessments. Within SAFE, we certainly don't describe these assessments as a measure of maturity. We've moved away from talking about maturity models. Instead, we see the assessments as an opportunity for the organizations to access the data it needs to improve. And what I mean by that is there might be something in an assessment, for example, that talks about perhaps the aspiration to release regularly, every single day, multiple times a week. If you're working in an organization that's developing a cyber-physical solution, that might not pertain to the way that you need to work, and therefore you wouldn't look to score 5 on that particular aspect. So please don't think of these as a maturity model. We're not asking every single organization to max out every single score. Rather, this is a tool you can use to reflect on your current levels of performance. Amra mentioned at the beginning that we've also released an update to the Agile Product Delivery assessment. And previous to that, we've also released updates to the team and technical agility, Lean-Agile leadership, and lean portfolio management assessments as well. And I just wanted to take a moment to say a couple of things about some of the updates we've been doing, supported by Comparative Agility, really helping to improve the whole assessment experience for yourselves. So the first thing to mention pertains to the business agility assessment. We took a key decision a few months ago to actually remove all the SAFE-specific terminology from that assessment. And what we found is that that's opened up real opportunities for organizations to start to use that well before they embark on their SAFE journey to explore their current ways of working and build the urgency and the need for change. And then additionally, as you can see on this slide here, we've been focusing on improving these core competency assessments. We were starting to see from the data collected that perhaps there were some assessment statements that were not being understood appropriately. We could see people were either skipping them or giving them average scores, really highlighting the fact that they weren't clear enough or easy enough to understand. So now all the assessment statements test a single condition. They really focus on the outcomes or behaviors we're looking at, rather than the existence of particular events or tasks. And we're doing our very best to make sure that any complex terminology is removed. We've certainly seen from the data collected since we've made these improvements that the assessment seems to be much easier for individuals to understand. Let me share now a little bit around how we're seeing these used within SAFE implementations. And what I like to do is put up the implementation roadmap, as you can see on the slide here, and just give some of the examples of the scenarios where we're starting to see this being applied. These are not meant to be exhaustive examples by any means, but they're certainly some of the more common ones that I start to see in the field. So of course, as I mentioned previously, the starting point and one of the most common applications of the assessments is using that business agility assessment right at the beginning of the journey. We're finding that that's creating the urgency and understanding of where the organization is starting from. It also creates wonderful input for the organization starting to develop their implementation plan. Perhaps they're finding that they've got real challenges around built-in quality, or perhaps they've got real challenges around understanding the needs of the customer or executing on their portfolio strategy. All that information is going to feed in to how they approach the SAFe implementation. Time and time again, we remind customers that SAFe can be used for many different reasons. Perhaps you've got challenges with satisfying customers. Perhaps you've got challenges with time to market. Understanding what those challenges are is important then to help you quantify the impact further down the road. Certainly, we never want to implement SAFe for the sake of doing SAFe. And as we start to go through the roadmap, we're seeing great opportunities for teams and arts to use the team and technical agility in the Agile Product Delivery assessments. We see many teams using the assessment as an input to their retrospectives. And also we've started to see many arts using something like the Agile Product Delivery assessment as an input to their inspect and adapt events. I'll talk in a moment about how we like to facilitate these, but briefly now, we're finding great opportunities for the teams really taking ownership of these assessments, running them locally, and then bringing the data back to understand how the whole entire art is performing. And then, of course, as you start to scale up your implementation, things like the Enterprise Solution Delivery Assessment, measuring how good we are at integrating suppliers, at managing across the entire value stream, and of course, the Lean Portfolio Management Assessment. Lean Portfolio Management is becoming really one of the key focus areas for many organizations looking to improve their ability to execute on their strategy. And the Lean Portfolio Management Assessment is a great diagnostic for them to really understand what it means to work more effectively and the areas they need to focus on. And then finally, that last scenario, scenario 5, just one reflection that I've seen applied many times is organizations starting to get into a rhythm, into an actual cadence of applying these assessments. Many people will ask me, what is the ideal cadence to run the assessments on? And what I seem to see working very well is something like every other PI. Every other PI, every 6 months, for example, maybe we're running the business agility assessment one time, and then we're alternating it with something different like the team and technical agility assessment. And that seems to be a nice balance with keeping the data fresh, which will be important when we come to talk about improvements shortly, but also not overloading the organization, recognizing that they probably have a lot of change initiatives underway and lots of other requests on the team. So twice a year seems to be a very recommended frequency. I've included in the presentation, but I'm not going to suggest I go through all of them, but this will be great reference, I hope, when we share that with the presentation with you afterwards, something that we found very useful when running the SAFe assessments. And that's this very simple template. One of the questions we sometimes get from the attendees, given that they have a lot of demands on their time, they get asked for metrics again and again, is really what is the why behind doing this assessment? What is the purpose that we're applying this for? What are some of the improvements and outcomes we're looking for? So for every one of those scenarios, I like to complete this template. I like to think about who are the people who would be ideal to be included in the assessment process. What is the purpose of this assessment? And you can see for this baseline one, I've got 4 things that I've called out there. And that purpose, I always make a point of sharing with the attendees so they understand why this is being asked of them. Which assessment are we going to use? What are some of the considerations around how we're going to facilitate this? Are we going to run it in a workshop collaboratively? Are we going to send out the survey to make sure we get a large amount of data? And then, of course, what is the frequency that we're going to start to apply this assessment? And by working with our customers and understanding how they've been using these effectively, I've been able to collect together the data for all the scenarios you saw in the roadmap through the application of all the different assessments. So as I mentioned, I won't go through this now, but I hope this will be a useful reference. And of course, if you're running your own assessments, you may find it useful to use this same template to really start to organize your thoughts ahead of starting to execute these in the field. But I do want to pause and say something a little more detail about how we're seeing these SAFe assessments being used effectively. I've put on the slide here 2 different approaches, both of which are completely valid, but I think one approach is certainly proving to be more effective, particularly for organizations that are new to the assessment process. On the right-hand side, first of all, the act then discuss is the fairly simple process of sending out a survey, going into comparative agility, setting up your team structure, getting access to the URL, and then sending that out to the individuals, all of whom will assess individually, but they'll also do it individually. And that's a great approach when we need a large amount of data, But what we're finding time and time again with the SAFE assessments is that actually we want to prioritize the quality of the data over the quantity of the data. And for that reason, we're recommending the approach described on the left-hand side, which is as much as possible to facilitate these assessments in a workshop setting. And the reason we're finding that so useful is it allows the facilitator really to set the context. It allows the people assessing, still assessing individually, mind you, to really understand and ask questions before they take the next step to decide what their response is going to be. And of course, and you'll see this on the next slide, it really allows wonderful discussions to start emerging from the assessment process. When we start to scale this, you might think that this becomes more challenging, but actually we've seen in the field that through the Scrum Masters facilitating with each team, it's very easy to scale this facilitation approach across the entire art or the entire portfolio. And of course, when we're doing things like the team and technical agility assessment, and we're starting to measure the proficiency and levels of competency across all the teams, it makes sense to have every single team member taking part. But for some of the other assessments, like the lean portfolio management or the business agility assessment, of course, we don't need necessarily hundreds and hundreds of data points. But as I mentioned previously, rather a collection of 20 to 30 individuals, well-informed, is certainly going to be enough to give you the data you need to start taking the next steps. But this slide here really reflects what we're seeing in the field time and time again. And this is why we emphasize, and I know Jorgen emphasizes this as well, there's much, much more to these assessments than just the number. It is not about saying that we scored 3.5 on built-in quality, or 4.2 on team of agile teams, or 3.7 on customer centricity. It's about understanding what it is that led to that particular outcome. So on the slide here, a very simple statement: the team of agile teams regularly demonstrates the integrated solution. This is from the team and technical agility assessment. I'm sure all of us on this call understand why an integrated solution is useful for demonstrating objective progress, but not everyone who's assessing may understand that. So in the workshop context, you have the ability to debate. What does this statement mean in our context? Does an integrated solution include our marketing plan? Does it include our steps to support the solution? Does it include how we're going to remediate any problems or how we're actually going to sell this particular solution? Do we know why this is a desired state? Do we recognize why an integrated solution is truly the best measure of progress? And then is this currently part of our transformation plan? If so, who owns it? If not, what do we have to do to make sure this is part of the work we're doing? And all these discussions and the things that arise through the assessment process are as valuable, if not more valuable, than the specific number in terms of the measurement. Of course, once you have the numbers, that's a great record of the assessment itself. And through the discussion you have in the workshop, you as the facilitator will have a much greater understanding of what led to that particular result. Now, to help with this, we put together, if you're not aware already, a Measure and Grow workshop toolkit. This is available from the SAFE community platform, and it takes about half a day to run, but you may choose to run this as 3 separate sessions if you wish. It has a whole section around facilitating the assessment, so giving you, the facilitator, the guidance you need to run the assessments effectively, to set up the scenarios, to create an environment where that questioning and that experiences will really surface. It then has a section that'll help you go through the data analysis. Myself and Jorgen will talk more about that shortly. And then it finally has a section which will allow you to work with the attendees to really facilitate an opportunity to think about what are some of the improvement actions we might want to take. And we've seen some organizations running this as a full half-day event. Other organizations choose to separate this into smaller events. Perhaps they want additional people to attend the section around identifying improvement opportunities. And that's what I want to talk about now, is what do we do and what are we seeing some of the good patterns in terms of identifying those improvements, what we call in SAFE the growth recommendations. Now, of course, Jorgen's going to show us very shortly how the Comparative Agility platform does all the data analysis for you. But I just want to talk about some of the categories that you're going to see when he does that demo and why we find them very useful inside a SAFE context. So, of course, across all the assessment statements, the particular assessment that we've used, we're going to start to measure our strengths and our opportunities. The strength is going to be those that have scored the highest in terms of the average scores across those who are assessed. And then the statements that have scored most positive compared to a benchmark will also be recognized as a strength, alongside those where we have the most agreement or the lowest standard deviation. And then, of course, counter to that, all the opportunities, the lowest scores, the furthest from the benchmark, and those where we have the highest levels of disagreement. And one thing we stress again and again with the assessments is to be mindful that we don't get into an approach where we only focus on the opportunities. we talk in SAFE about building the momentum of change, and actually some of the small wins really help us to sustain that momentum. So making sure every time we do the assessments to focus on some of those strengths and to really amplify those throughout the organization is a great way to celebrate the wins that we put in place. But of course, the opportunities will be the things that will provide the best benefits in terms of things we might choose to focus on. When we think about the lowest scores, one of the things we like to do is also think about how we might segment the data. If we're doing something like a Lean-Agile leadership assessment, perhaps we want to segment the data by those recognized leaders within the organization and those who are not the recognized leaders, but are also assessing on those individuals. Perhaps when we assess lean portfolio management, we might find it useful to segment the data by the LACE, the PMO, and the actual lean portfolio management team. And sometimes what we find, or many times we find that the multiple viewpoints really help to surface and understand where the true opportunities for improvement are. Certainly, we also put a lot of weight on those statements that have the largest difference in terms of agreement, the largest standard deviation. And again, we're finding that either those point to a siloed transformation effort where one part of the organization doesn't have access to the support another does, or perhaps more importantly, a misunderstanding in terms of what the statement was actually asking. In either case, it warrants further investigation. Just one thing to be mindful of before I go to the next slide, though, is there are some caveats anytime we're starting to analyze the data. And one thing I'm always mindful of, and you can see it in the little cartoon on the right-hand side, is be very careful when we aggregate the data too much. And that's why I like to segment and think about the different viewpoints within the assessment. That's why we like to do the assessment in the workshop format. Sometimes the aggregated data can really hide some of the differences. That's also why looking at the standard deviation is so important. Be careful, of course, about using the data to rank the teams or portfolios across the business. They're all on a different part of the journey. They all have different challenges that they need to address. And of course, we're all very aware that actually when you start to run the assessments the first time, you may find initially that the scores and the results may be lower, or maybe higher to start with and then get lower the second or third time you run them as individuals become more perceptive of what is actually being asked and what it actually means to work in a lean agile way. I also mentioned at the bottom, be careful of following up on too many things at once. The recommendation that we've started to see and the thing that we've put into the toolkit is 3 to 5 opportunities, 3 to 5 assessment statements is a good number to make sure that batch doesn't get too big. And the process we follow is very, very simple. We ask the attendees through the last part of the workshop to assess and analyze the data that's being collected. We ask them to identify the 3 to 5 assessment statements that really provide the greatest opportunity. And then for each of those assessment statements, like the one you see in the top left of the slide here, we ask them to identify 3 growth recommendations. So this particular assessment statement, the one about the integrated solution, we've got 3 growth recommendations here. One is about creating an integrated environment. One is about a set of automated tests. And one is about making that test data available to the people who are doing that integration. The reason we like to have 3 growth recommendations for each statement is we want to balance the things that can really deliver benefit in the short term and those things that might take longer and more time to put in place. So all the time we're trying to balance the effort against the value that it's going to deliver. And by having a small number of opportunities to improve attached to a particular statement, it really helps to give you that balance. We're then starting to see huge benefit from organizations that are taking those growth recommendations and using either stories, features, or epics, the work items within SAFE, to describe them effectively. Of course, it'll be a story if it's something a team can deliver, a feature if it requires an art, an epic if it requires portfolio governance. And the true benefit that we're seeing here is it forces those people who are helping to describe this growth recommendation to really think about what is the benefit hypothesis and how will we know when this is done. We really want to take a structured approach to improvement within SAFE. That's why we have events like the Inspect and Adapt. And the structured approach means being very thoughtful about the expected outcomes and then understanding whether we can actually measure whether something has actually been delivered. And then, of course, once we have a good understanding of these growth recommendations, we can then start to apply some of the tried and tested prioritization approaches. And as you know, within SAFE, when we prioritize the program backlog, the backlog of features, we use weighted shortest job first. And this is a great way to balance the value delivered against the effort that it's going to take. And we really want to maximize that value delivered for the effort that we expend to deliver that particular item. And we're seeing also the same approach can work really well when prioritizing growth recommendations, the opportunities for improvement. So for all these potential improvement items, we can ask ourselves which ones deliver the most value to the business or potentially to the end customer, which ones are most time critical, and which ones potentially reduce risk the most to provide the greatest future opportunities. And by summing those things together on a relative scale, that's going to give us an understanding of our cost to delay. In other words, the value that we'd lose by not doing this. And then, of course, we can divide that by the job size to give us the best ratio of value to effort expended. And this is a great way to make sure that you're always addressing both the most important things, but also the things that you have the capacity available to deliver in the time available. Now, everything that I've talked about so far really describes growth recommendations that you as organizations will put together, things that, given your understanding of your context, you'll identify as important things to work on. But we also started recently, with the help of Comparative Agility, on a brand new initiative. And I want to say something about this on the slide here, but then shortly I'm going to let Jorgen really show you what this looks like in action. We've started now to include inside the assessment, starting with the Team and Technical Agility assessment and the Agile Product Delivery assessment, embedded growth recommendations. As an example to the scale here, inside the Team and Technical Agility assessment, there's 170 curated activities designed to improve proficiency in a particular area. So what that means is every single assessment statement has between 3 and 5 growth recommendations. And the growth recommendations have the same format that you can see on the slide here. They're attached to a particular statement. And then the growth recommendation itself starts with a portion in italics. And the portion in italics talks about a potential root cause. So maybe the reason that you scored low on the statement that says the art includes all the necessary people to develop and deliver the solution is because the art does not include business teams. Now, there could be other root causes. And that's why every single assessment statement has up to 5 growth recommendations, because it has a breadth of different root causes. So you can find the one that you think really describes the situation that you're facing. That's then followed by an activity. Let's identify those additional teams to build the entire business solution. The activity has a set of steps. Every activity links to a resource directly in the Safe Community platform. Here you can see it links to a video called Organizational Agility, Lean-Agile Ways of Working Across the Enterprise. And that resource will provide you the information you need to execute this activity successfully. And then finally, every single growth recommendation ends with an outcome. What's the specific outcome you can expect from actually carrying out this activity? We're finding these really useful for a couple of reasons. Number one is when you start to scale the transformation activities across the organization, you may not have all the coaching capacity you need to be fully hands-on with the teams all the time. So giving them this autonomy, this ability to really understand their potential next steps is a great way to build out the sustainability and scale the transformation. The other thing, of course, is that it gives the teams autonomy to decide what it is that they need to do to really take the improvement actions that really describe the ways that they're working. So recognizing that each team will be working slightly differently, each part of the business may have particular needs, this really allows them to select and build out a plan of development that's going to describe the work that they need to do. We're super excited about this. We're continuing to invest in this. Recently, we added the growth recommendations for Agile Product Delivery, and I'm excited for you to see this when Jorgen shows it very shortly. So let me just finish now in my final section with some really exciting research that Jorgen shared with me fairly recently around the business agility assessment. So just remember that that business agility assessment is the assessment that gives you the broad overview across all 7 core competencies in terms of how is the portfolio performing. It's our most widely used assessment, and time again, we're seeing organizations running this assessment on a cadence. So we're starting to gather really good data and get a better understanding of what it means to measure and attain high levels of business performance. So what you're looking at on this slide here is an impact matrix taken from Comparative Agility. And on that impact matrix, we've got all the points from a collection of organizations that have taken the business agility assessment. Now, the matrix has 2 dimensions, of course. On the y-axis, we have cohesion. This talks about the level of agreement that we have across those who are assessing. The higher the level of cohesion, the higher the level of agreement of the data points within inside a particular assessment for an organization. And of course, the x-axis represents performance. How well are they performing? How high are those scores within the business agility assessment? And what that leads you to realize that in the top right quadrant, we have what we might call the high performing organizations. These are those that have high levels of cohesion, where there's an agreed understanding of how they're performing and high levels of performance. They are simply scoring high when they assess across the business agility assessment. Once we had that data set, Jorgen's team were able to then ask the question, well, what makes these particular organizations unique? What are some of the common attributes when we start to analyze high performance? And what we found was that there were 6 questions, and you can see them on the slide here, 6 statements that again and again, when subjected to different methods of analysis, showed a strong correlation in terms of assessment statements that were scoring highly again and again for these organizations that were attaining levels of high performance. And I put these assessment statements on the slide here just so I can say something about each of them. And I truly think the data is both incredibly interesting, and when you see the questions as I go through them, I think you'll agree that the areas that have been highlighted are extremely useful in terms of how important they are in setting the foundation of Lean-Agile ways of working. So this was really eye-opening for us in terms of organizations that have put these practices in place successfully, but also it's very satisfying to see. So the first one was a question that came up in team and technical agility. We build high-quality solutions. All those high-performing enterprises were agreeing that they had reached a level of high quality in their solution development. And we know how important built-in quality is. Some of these organizations work in safety-critical industries. Quality issues are not just simply upset customers. They can be much more serious than that. But poor quality also leads to high levels of rework. That affects flow. It affects our ability to deliver value to the market quickly. And of course, it does ultimately lead to us struggling to compete in the market as our customers get more and more dissatisfied. So it was wonderful to see that this was an area of focus for those high-performing enterprises. And then the second one, again, a really nice one that we're seeing this one here. Our suppliers participate in our agile development processes. Many organizations rely on suppliers, as they develop their solutions, either to staff the agile release trains, or potentially they're outsourcing the entire solution development process. Many of those suppliers do work using Lean-Agile ways of working, but many of them are more traditional. The more traditional suppliers, of course, we ask the enterprises to work closely with them to help integrate them to the agile processes, getting them involved in things like PI planning, the system demos, the inspect and adapt. And again, it's great to see that the recommended guidance that we put in place that many of us have been talking about for a long time really is reflective of those organizations that are scoring highly across the business agility assessment. The next two I'm going to build at the same time because they both relate to the vision. And again, this is a wonderful assessment, a set of 2 assessment statements to see here, because we know how important alignment is. We talk about in SAFE about the need to create a vision to really ensure that the entire portfolio understands the work to be done to execute the strategy effectively. But we also talk about alignment as one of our SAFE core values. And we know that if we don't have alignment to the vision, it becomes much more difficult to steer and execute that strategy. The people working in the teams become much more disconnected from the work to be done. They find it much harder to answer the question, what is the value that they're delivering to the enterprise? On the flip side, if we can generate good alignment, it's wonderful. The employees feel empowered, they feel impassioned, we all have a customer-centric view, we're all moving in the same direction, and of course, we're going to start to deliver better results. So it was wonderful to see these bubbling up as a measure of high performance. And then the penultimate one is around moving away from project-based funding. You know, SAFE has talked about for some time, and of course, the wider Lean-Agile community has also spoken about the move from project to products. We want to move away from these short-term temporal projects where we bring together a group of individuals and then disband them at the end to something much longer-lived, a focus on the customer delivering long-lived products that we can continue to invest in over time. And of course, moving away from project-based funding means that we have the ability to fund those products directly and make key decisions much more quickly about where we want to allocate those funds as we see opportunities in the market. That is truly an enabler of business agility. And then finally, and again, just wonderful to see this as something that organizations are valuing who are attaining high levels of performance in business agility. Leaders moving decision-making down into the teams, looking to decentralize some of that centralized authority, looking to help the teams to upskill, to put the guardrails in place, to understand what it means, to use all their local knowledge to take the best decisions in a much more timely manner. And I think before I saw this research that Jorgen showed me, as if Jorgen had asked me to select a set of 6 statements that really describe at the heart what it looks like to attain business agility, the set would look very much like this: building in quality, focusing on suppliers, aligned to a vision, funding in new ways, and of course, Lean-Agile leadership, decentralizing decision-making. So this was so interesting, and certainly myself and Jorgen will look to share this data more widely in the future. So final thoughts to me before I hand it over to Jorgen. Just some reflections on what we've seen working well. Small number of data trends at one time. Don't open up too many opportunities for improvement. The data will get old, so using the assessments on a cadence is what we're seeing many safe enterprises doing. And of course, us as the facilitators, it's very important to make sure we get feedback on how the assessments were received. And as much as possible, we're trying to make these tools available to the teams to decentralize the access to them so everyone starts to see the benefits of assessing regularly. And of course, don't forget, once we've done the assessment process, it's very important to close the loop and let the organization and those who gave up their time to really understand the impact that it's had and the improvements that it's led to. Many improvements, of course, will require leadership support to really affect the change. So I hope that was a useful reflection and update on where we are with the safe assessments. I'm going to pass it over to Jorgen now, who's going to show you in action some of the things I talked about. Jorgen, over to you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Andy. I thought these results were really interesting too. And I think part of what it's showing us is that we're now moving away from, I mean, if there was ever any discussion, team to organization. I mean, if you think of those statements, at least 6 of them, those are critical to accomplish business agility. You can see that 5 of those are purely going beyond the team. So that shows you that the business agility requires leadership support, just like you said. So very good. Well, I'm going to share my screen here to see if I can pull this up, and hopefully you can see this. One thing I wanted to say and give some kudos to Safe. Can you see my screen? Well, hopefully you can. And this, you should see the, there you go, thumbs up. One thing that I think is really great with our partnership has been that we've been sharing data, we've been working together, looking at the analysis, looking at the community. And one thing that I think has been really great is that, SAFE has been open from the beginning. You can go to the big picture, you can take advantage of all these resources, and you can see this, and it doesn't cost you a cent. And I think that's really important for agility in general. I think a lot of work has been put into this. You can probably hear that from Andy in terms of the quality, in terms of the work that's been to the growth recommendations. All of that takes a lot of time and resources, but it is open. Obviously, there's proprietary items that's also behind a paywall, but I think it's open and it's available to everyone without paying a cent just to get started. And that's important. And that's the same thing with comparative agility. When you go to comparative agility and you log in, it's free. You don't have to pay anything to get going. And as you see here, all the safe capabilities, all the capacities are right here, and you can use them at your leisure. So that shouldn't cost you anything. And I think it's a great benefit to the whole community. But let's go into some of the ways that we can actually use this. So what I'm going to do is go straight to one business agility report, kind of tell you sort of the high level view of that, and then go into some of the details and especially the growth recommendations that we were talking about. I thought those could be really useful. Here's a business agility report that's been run. And as Andy was saying, the type of audience that you run that report with is not the same as team and technical agility. Or some of the other ones as well. This is really one of those things you do at first because it gives you a really good view of what's going on with a limited number of people that are involved, because they're sort of the tip of the spear, if you will. In this case, we're looking at about 3 teams, the LACE, the leadership team, and the core ART members. Not a huge data set, but enough to start to see where there might be items we should focus on. If you look at this business agility report right here, you can see that a couple of things are standing out. Essentially, 0 here is essentially the benchmark. So that's normalized to 0. And everything that you see here that's below the line shows you that it's underperforming compared to the benchmark. And if we look at this in technical agility, you can see there's a line here that stands out a little bit. This one here, for instance, I'm not sure if you can read this, but it says, we build high quality solutions. If you remember, that's one of those statements that we found was really important. That was one of those 6 statements. So if this is the kind of report you run when you run the business agility report, one of the things you'll see right away is that, okay, let's now dig in to team and technical agility and go a little bit further. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So what we will do in comparative agility, you will go then into team and technical agility. You will choose that as your capability. And what you can do is you can look at your portfolio, just like Andy was saying. You can look at the core product. You can look at all the teams involved. And why don't we just run this for all the teams right now to show how they're doing when it comes to team and technical agility. So I'm going to type in this right here just to run that report. And then look at what we get when we run this report across all the different teams in that particular art or that particular portfolio. Now, again, we can look at these results, and right off the bat, we can see a couple of things stand out. First, let's note that all of the teams are involved here. So this could be an entire art. So it's a different data set, but we're getting a little bit deeper now. So you can get more concrete and more action-oriented. As we look at this data, just like Andy was saying, a couple of things stand out. You can look at the insights, the key strengths, and the key opportunities, and you can start to see where they're doing fairly well and when there might be some potential issues. Now, if you go to key opportunities here, for instance, you could see a couple of things stand out here. For instance, our team has all the skills necessary to deliver our work. That's what you see here. That's this particular statement. Okay, so here we're seeing that the team does not have all the skills necessary to deliver work. Well, it makes sense. If you're thinking of things like creating a high quality solution, without all those people, without those skills, knowledge, and abilities across that value stream, yeah, you're going to have some problems. And this statement's clearly stand out right here, not just as an average, but also as a negative difference from the benchmark. And that shows you that, okay, this is something we may want to dig into a little deeper. Now, before we go there, one thing that could be useful here is to look at this in context. Just like Andy was saying, you don't want to boil the ocean. You can't solve everything at once, and you need to be able to prioritize your efforts. This is where the impact matrix can be really useful, because if you run the impact matrix, what you will be able to do is map all those teams against each other in a relative fashion. So you can start to see that given the relative scores that we have, how do these teams perform? This is not about competition, but it's about understanding the relative challenges. So you can start to see where you can be most useful and where you can spend most of your time. If you look at the green zone here, which is what we call amplify, in this case, you have high performance and high cohesion. That means that these teams are indicating they're doing relatively well, and they tend to be on the same page, just like Andy was mentioning earlier. Now, these teams, let's amplify them. Let's look at what they're doing. Let's share what they're doing with the rest of the teams. Let's share that goodness across the organizations. Brown bag lunches, those kind of things. Very inexpensive ways to make sure that you can spread that high performance across the organization. But then if you go here in the yellow zone, this is called align. These are high performance, low cohesion. These are teams that are doing fairly well, but are not really related to each other in terms of agreement. That can be a challenge. In this case, there's not a lot of teams there, so that's good. But if you go here in mitigate, you see that you need to do something right away. These are teams that have low performance and low cohesion. They're basically screaming for help. So if you look at prioritization, this is probably the kind of teams that I would focus on first. And you can then click on any of these to run specific workshops on them specifically. You can get the big picture to look at the entire portfolio, and then you can go more specifically into that particular team. If I double click on this, for instance, I will run a report that's specific to just that one team that's indicating that there are challenges, and then we can see how they're doing. And as you can see here, these results are quite different from what we saw when we looked at the entire portfolio overall. Now, it's important to go high and low, be able to look at the high level view and then go down to the deep and also be specific to the team. But what I think is more important too is to understand what you do. What are the measurements? What are the growth recommendations? And like Andy was saying, that's integrated into the tool. If we look at this here, you saw that one of the issues we had was around that the team doesn't have the skills necessary to deliver our work. What can we do here? Well, SAFE, in collaboration with Comparative Agility, has spent a lot of time coming up with very concrete recommendations of how that can be done better. And as you can look at this, here's one recommendation. So we're seeing here that the team doesn't have all the skills necessary. Well, okay, here's an hypothesis. What can we do about this? Well, here's some activities you can run to make sure that we can make sure there's higher alignment and the skills, knowledge, and abilities with those teams can get to a common page. One thing that is really great here is that you have further recommendations among the activities to also go to an outside link. Now, if you go to SAFE here, and you do have to have a SAFE certification to access this, you can now look at specific articles and tools that are specific to that particular challenge. I think that's a really useful way to kind of tie in the data to specific actions. Look at this one here, for instance. Here they're having issues around skills and problems around identifying and resolve skill gaps. Well, one thing you could do here is to use tools to do that. And if you click on this, you'll go to some of the tools that SAFE has implemented as part of their platform. And in this case, I think it's called Collaborate. And that's a way for you to go in here and use an improvement roadmap, for instance. A nice, simple way for you to look at how we can improve in the way we work. So the point I'm trying to make here is that when you have this integrated into one fellow solution that combines not just the data, but also the recommendations, you can start to look at this as part of your portfolio of improvement opportunities, because that's what this becomes. This becomes work, whether that's an epic, whether it's a story or a task, like Andy says, it depends on the scope. But the point is, this is work that needs to be done. This is not something that is less worth than, for instance, a product feature. If we want to continuously improve the way we work, we need to think about these also and treat these type of improvement opportunities as first-class citizens.